You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, welcome to Indications. I'm Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Today I'm being joined by George Friedman. George is an internationally recognized geopolitical forecaster and strategist on international affairs. He's the founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. He's very well known for a lot of writings and speaking that he's been doing. He's a New York Times bestselling author, and one of his most popular books that some of you on this podcast may know about is called The Next 100 Years. And there's a new book coming out very soon, which I will mention to you at the end of this podcast. George, thank you for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
We're going to take a preview of your annual global geopolitical forecast, which is going to appear in February next year. But you've got some really interesting insights here that we would like to share at the Conference Board. We do an economic outlook every year. This is a geopolitical outlook, and really want to use this conversation to bring the two a little bit together. And frankly, when I was looking at your notes, the thing that I saw that actually you did bring them together. Your statement is actually that economic dysfunction will be the main driver of the international system in 2020, but underlying that economic dysfunction, the most important dimension of that is the increase in social instability, and something that actually has been with us already for quite a while, basically since the financial crisis of 2008. So I think my question is, why is this going to hit us in 2020?
Well, it's been hitting us. It's going to continue to hit us, and it's going to become more intense. The basic problem that 2008 kicked off was the crisis of interdependence. Everybody believed interdependence was wonderful, exports were great, let's do more. And they suddenly discovered that the subprime crisis spread so quickly through the system they couldn't control it. And then it was discovered that the exporting countries couldn't maintain their exports. And as a result of this, there was a kind of global economic slowdown that's never not been solved to this point.
It actually took us a while before we figured out that's what we discovered. You know what I mean? I mean, it took us a while to recover from this crisis, and we put the blame on, the systemic crisis in the housing market and subprime mortgage. But as you say, there was this underlying sort of disconnect from globalization, but it took us a while to realize that, right?
It did. It also took us a while to realize that in the United States and in Europe, a class distinction had grown up, and this was the social unrest. All that 2008 did was intensify it. I'll give you an example. In the United States, the lower middle class, 1/4 of the population, earns $35,000 a year. Okay, that's 1/4 of the population. They take home about $2,600 a year, depending on what state they live in. $2,600 a month. You can't earn a living that way. You can't buy a house. Maybe you can buy a car. The American dream of a house, car, a vacation that the lower middle class had 20, 30 years ago is gone. And the pressure on these people is enormous. And the pressure back from these people is enormous. It's not only the pressure from the economics, it's the pressure from culture. These people had been in Baptist churches and Catholic churches. They had been raised a certain way. They're now being told they're phobic, that they have a mental incapacity to, perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. But it doesn't take a genius to know that they resent deeply the contempt in which they feel they're held.
So it was actually the average American who figured this out before we experts figured it out.
Well, I think his name was Donald Trump.
He figured it out maybe even earlier than many of us.
He understood that the cultures of the Northeast and the West Coast were not necessarily the cultures of the rest of the country. And he understood that they were bitter about things like imports. They felt the imports had taken their jobs away. While everybody was celebrating international interdependence and how wonderful it is, their jobs are taken in large part. Now, to some extent, they overstated how much it was taken by that, but they still felt that. They felt under pressure from immigrants, and that was not only in the United States, that was throughout much of the world. All of these things came together in a social crisis that included a very different set of values collided. There was the coasts, if you will, in the United States that were deeply committed to free trade, to the idea of being competitive, that looked at the economy in terms of the GDP and said, hey, we're doing fine, who didn't realize these people were being crushed. Donald Trump came along and he ran a campaign against these people.
So I understand now this social dysfunction, which you explain here very well. The question I then have to you is, but how does that then translate into the economic dysfunction, by which I mean, I'm chief economist here. I do the outlook for 2020, and I'm saying, well, are we going to have a recession or not a recession? You're basically saying, whatever way you look at this social dysfunction is translating itself seriously into economic dysfunction. How do you see that link?
Our economic figures are aggregate for how 330 million people are doing. There's the old joke that says economists put one person's head in the oven, other person's feet on ice, and say, on average, you're doing fine.
That economic joke I didn't actually know, so thank you for that one.
So, I mean, that's the problem. When we look at the aggregate of the United States, we're doing fine. That doesn't mean that everyone is fine. It means sometimes that some people, half the people, are doing wonderfully.
So inequality, essentially.
Well, it's inequality, but it's a mistake to think that the anger comes from inequality. American society accepts the idea that there's unequal outcomes. The misery comes from the fact that they can't have the things their parents had.
Right.
That working in a job no longer guarantees them homes, health insurance, things like that.
No way to get out of the inequality trap.
They're in the inequality trap, and that inequality is not the bitterness that he has more. It's that I don't have what I need. And it also has a social dimension, which is the things that I believe in are held in contempt. That's profound alienation in a society. And as I said before, we shouldn't be surprised that we get a president who encapsulates that alienation, is held in contempt by that other society, and still wins.
So what is it then, the still thing that I want to ask you before we move on is, why is this going to crush us in 2020? You did say it's crushing us along the line, but you're particularly putting emphasis on 2020, whereas, again, as an economist, I'm looking at the numbers and say, well, we may have a recession in 2020, but frankly, incomes are good, the labor market is good, the consumer is spending money. Why is 2020 going to be the bad year?
Because in 2020, the United States is going to have an election. And in that election, all those claims that we're doing well are going to be questioned. Trump came to power saying, make America great again. Most of his opponents had no idea what he was talking about. They thought America was doing pretty well. His supporters knew it. Now we're going to be spending the next year discussing how we're doing. And we're not going to be allowed to express it in terms that economists like to use. They like to use aggregate terms. We're going to be discussing it in very detailed terms. How am I doing? And that bitterness grows. We have had a bitter 4 years, and we're entering a period where that's the subject on the table. Add to that the impeachment issue. I mean, you have a group of people who feel, my God, we have to get rid of this guy. And a large group of people who say, this is a coup d'etat. So 2020 is going to be a very painful time in our social relations.
So we're going to see that division and that polarization fully played out in front of us during the presidential campaign, and that's going to create us real issues in 2020.
We were able to say last year after that, we were able to give our aggregate numbers, say we're doing fine. In an election,
right,
in 50 states, you can't do that. And that's why the Electoral College is so important, because the Electoral College does not let you speak of the United States on the whole. It forces you to speak in very specific ways. And when that discussion is held, the anger is great. I live outside of Hays. I live in a place called Hays County in Texas. It's filled with tech millionaires, and the old folk who live there. They don't understand each other. They don't know each other. They don't like each other. So we have to understand it comes from both ways, both sides. On the one side, you have a whole class of technocrats who think that they own the country in a way and look at these other people as the derelict past. Then you have the derelict past who looks at these people and says, these people have usurped my country, have taken it away from me. And in American elections, because of the way the founders designed them, it gets real up close and personal.
Yeah. Let's go back to the aggregate for a moment, but also let's go a little bit beyond the US. One of your very interesting statements in your analysis is that the economic power in the world has basically shifted from exporting nations or net exporting nations to net importing nations. Explain this to us in a little more detail.
After World War II, the U.S. designed a world with its allies. And the question was, how do we build up our allies? How do we build up a Germany, a Japan, an Italy? And the American model was, you export your way to wealth, and we Americans will buy your goods. In the case of Germany, we had no tariffs on German goods to the United States. They were allowed to protect their economy. We did it because we wanted to build an anti-Soviet bloc. This notion of exporting as an inherent good that showed a really efficient economy, whereas if you were not an exporter, you somehow were backward, came to a test in 2008. In 2008, we had a sudden, stark recession in which the ability of people to buy goods contracted. In the United States, it was particularly onerous on the social class we were talking about. Those who shopped at Walmart. Those who didn't shop at Walmart felt it less. Those who shopped at Walmart were under tremendous pressure from this crisis. And this was the market that the Chinese were supplying, for example. And suddenly they couldn't sell. And where they used to sell 30, 40% of their economy as GDP, as exports, it suddenly fell. And the entire system in China weakened and collapsed. And as it weakened and collapsed, the banking system was in deep trouble. Businesses were in deep trouble. Whereas on the other hand, the United States realized that it had tremendous power. It was the largest importer in the world. Apart from the largest economy, the largest importer. If it imported, it could sustain a country. If it refused to import, well, that would be another question.
So that actually leads me then to, because this is then my puzzle, right? If I look at the President Trump, he's actually not happy at all that we're an importer. He actually thinks we should be less of a net importer. We should actually to export our great American products to the rest of the world. So is the president missing that part of your story, or is he actually responding to the trend that you are describing?
Well, he's taking this position. First, he was elected by people who thought the Chinese were stealing their jobs, that all of this importing was destroying their lives. He's their prisoner. He has to answer them. Secondly, he was dealing with a China who didn't actually practice free trade, who blocked American imports in various ways, which was a real problem. And he then realized that, look, in the case of China we're talking about, we have the upper hand. We export about 0.5% of our GDP to China. They export about 4% of their GDP to the U.S. I think it's larger. We can put tariffs on them and control them and shape the trade. In other words, many people were talking about globalism being a problem on the left. Many people were talking about fair trade, not free trade. Many people were talking about shaping trade and controlling the pattern. What Trump did basically was say, politically, these are my people. I've got no choice, right or wrong. And said to the Chinese, look, in previous administrations, people have come asking you not to manipulate your currency. People came to you asking you to open up the markets. You said you would, you didn't. Okay, enough. Now we are taking our counter. And because the United States exports relatively little to the world, we export 13% of our GDP total, almost half of that to North America, to Mexico and Canada. Since we're minor exporters, we can create trade wars that we have inherent ability to win.
So why then does the president, and not just the president, but many people around him, strongly believe that economic power ultimately is about becoming an exporting nation rather than being an importing nation?
Well,
that's what he keeps telling us. He says we need to export to the rest of the world and we should reduce our trade deficit. That's what's giving us power.
He says that, but the problem of trade is you're hostage to your customer's intelligence. If you have a customer who does stupid things, you're going to pay for it. While when you're exporting to a customer who's doing well, that's great, but it's not in your control. And I think underneath what Trump is thinking, and it's hard to know what he's thinking sometimes, is this idea that I'm looking at the Chinese, I'm looking at the Japanese, I'm looking at parts of Europe, and they're not in control of their futures. We in the United States export little. We're in control. And the question that emerged in 2008 is, how much control do we have over our economies and our lives? When the U.S. had the subprime crisis, it spread so rapidly to the system that it affected everybody. No one could defend themselves. When you're an exporter, you are dependent on your customer. The United States has a strength in not being dependent. Therefore, I think his position is, yes, we will trade, we will export into China on terms that are equivalent. The Chinese problem is that 2008 left them staggered. They speak a great deal about how powerful they are, but if you take a look at their banking system, if you take a look at declining growth rates, which they admit, not other things, when we take a look at the unrest that is in China, we see a country that's troubled. The last thing you can do is open its markets to American goods. And Trump's position is, not only with China, but with other countries, look, we have a problem with you. We're going to solve it this way. When Trump said, look, we're not going to keep our troops on the Turkish border, he was partly saying, we have spent 18 years keeping our troops there and it didn't work. But he also said, we have other methods. So one of the ways we've handled Iran is not to go to war with them. It's to put sanctions on them. Sanctions on Russia. Sanctions on China. When you go through the entire list of countries that, say, 20 years ago we would have considered war with, we're not considering it. He's going to our strong point.
That's actually a really good transition to the last thing I want to talk about, which is sort of, military warfare versus economic warfare and the transition that you're describing from a preference for economic warfare over military warfare. Let me ask you this question. When it comes to U.S. supremacy, economically and politically in the world, who's the biggest enemy of that? Is it Russia? Is it China? Or is it the U.S. itself?
Well, when you talk about economic power, you talk about military power, and vice versa. They're intimately linked. When you look at China, you see a country that is emerging into having a major military, that has demanded control over the South China Sea, has demanded it for 10 years, and has been ignored. So here's an issue that is of fundamental interest to China, that they have not been able to rectify militarily. So you have to say, this is not a major power. If somebody challenged the United States in the Caribbean, there'd be a discussion. When you look at Russia, they lost the borderland that they had since the 17th century. They lost the Baltics. They lost Ukraine. They neutralized Belarus. But the entire borderland that protected them from German invasion or Swedish invasion or French invasion, it's gone. Their borderland is gone now. They have a weak buffer. This is the foundation of Russian national strategy, and it's shattered. The Russians can go to, say, Syria if they want, and nobody really cares. And they can portray this as a major expeditionary force, which it's impressive. But their basic problem has always been the threat from Europe. There is no threat from Europe now, but who knows what will come. And they've lost it. And they've not been able to regain it. And the way you judge military power is very simple. If you really need something, the South China Sea or the borderland, and you can't get it back, you're weak. And the United States, on the other hand, is very strong. We're an island. North America is an island. And we control both the Atlantic and the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and so on. And we are in a unique position that we can invade, we can't be invaded. And that gives the United States a tremendous advantage. Is it eternal? No. No, none is. But the United States is unique.
So that's a note of optimism we can end on, right? At least from a U.S. perspective, that despite all the, social tensions, political tensions, economic tensions that you're describing, there is a future for the United States. It's actually linked to a book that you're going to publish in early 2020 called The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, the Coming Crisis of the 2020s, and the Triumph Beyond. So there is good news ahead. What is your most important advice to Americans in order to triumph?
To understand this has happened before. We had a fundamental crisis in the 1960s and 70s. It resulted in Ronald Reagan later. We had a fundamental crisis emerging in the 1920s that resulted in Roosevelt and everything that came after. We had the Civil War. We had enormously tense things. I mean, people say people don't talk to each other now. Imagine them in 1861. We are built to survive stress. We move so quickly. We're an artificial nation. We were invented. Our population is invented. Our regime is invented. We reinvented the meaning of our geography. And we change rapidly, and that creates crises. And in those crises, we believe we're finished. We've never seen anything like this again. So the one way to get through it is, well, you'll get through it. But you might read some history to realize, oh, we've done this before. This is the way we do it. We're like an opera. And now the fat lady is going to sing at some point and it'll be over.
So looking backward, understanding history to understand the future better, that's really a good way to end this podcast. And George, we'll hope to have you back soon to discuss that in a little bit more detail. Thank you very much for joining us, George Friedman, Chairman of Geopolitical Futures. Thank you for joining Indications. If you'd like to know more about all the offerings at the Conference Board, please do go to our website, tcb.org, where you can also subscribe to our podcast series. Thank you. My name is Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.